So I do. But hey, we have a little bit of a controversial thing to talk about here. And so this is actually, by the way, one of our best performing podcast episodes and
Mm.
chat and things we ever did and YouTube videos. It's always getting comments. And we did it with your friend Joanna. We did a big episode with her, and it was in defense of A Feast for Crows, which we are edging closer towards. And actually, we have a ton of comments on this, but we had one the other day I thought was really interesting. And it is from Yerp7444, who says, I understand why it's slow for some people. The first and third books were sprinting. This book is like, whoa. Let me describe some stuff as we go. If you're trying to get to the end of the story, you're trying not to look, at every statue and park and everything along the way. But the reread is fire. There's so much tea, so much world building, and setting up for major events. It's basically just goes on, just praises the book. And I thought I want to talk a little bit about that because it is such an interesting thing. Because it's the first time George really did split the books, right?
Yeah. He ran into a huge issue and ended up doing the geographical split that was suggested by his assistant at the time, Daniel Abraham, who's went on to, obviously become a very successful author. He's the co-author of The Expanse, and he's doing well for himself for sure. But that, Daniel Abraham is the one who suggested it. So they ended up splitting the book. And I think, as far as the length of time we've been waiting for Winds of Winter, I think we both agree that the split and the removal of the 5-year gap, all of that made everything way harder, for sure. But yeah, it was a split book, so it's already kind of a little bit awkward. Like a lot of people complain that Feast and Dance don't feel like they have super proper endings. I disagree on the side of Dance with Dragons, even though it does almost feel like a part one of a story in some ways. But, John dying at the end of A Dance with Dragons is a huge
cliffhanger. Huge cliffhanger. I mean, he's essentially, in the show, he really is your main character. But in the books, I still kind of felt like John was the main character too, because when I started reading the books, obviously it was like season 3 of Game of Thrones, and so that's when I was like starting to read it, and I maybe it was just because the show had also kind of set him up to be kind of the main character a little bit, but to me it was the most interesting story. The one I gravitated towards most, just because it's like I'm here for like the White Walkers and what's going on and Jon Snow's mother. Like that was the most intriguing story for me. But actually, in this big episode we did with Joanna, where we talked about it, in a lot of comments, we talked about how much we love the Cersei chapters, because
Cersei becomes full. I mean, she becomes like the full.
And her chapters, if you don't like the character, her chapters are amazing.
Oh, she's unhinged, dude.
They are some of the best written chapters in the whole series.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'm fine with it getting a little slow and slowing down a little bit, but I think part of the reason it feels like it slows down is just because of the way it's split.
I agree.
Like what we're doing now, I mean, even you go back to Clash of Kings or where we're at now, where we just finished the Red Wedding, so this actually is kind of a good place to kind of like take a step back and like look at the Red Wedding in a whole, because the next week we'll be in the Tyrion, where it's the whole like, hey, Robb Stark's dead. Okay, now we're moving into the next phase.
Yeah, and Feast, by the way, is kind of the continuation of that storyline, right?
Yeah.
Like it very much centers around the Riverlands and the Freys, Jaime, Cersei. Like it is the natural continuation of that storyline.
Right. So even here, it's like you're going Arya, Catelyn, Arya, and you're getting like, okay, all these sides. Same thing like we got with the Battle of the Blackwater, right? Or when we had the Bran and Jon chapter, and they're, it's like, oh man, like here's Bran and he's in the tower and Jon's over there too. Oh man, if they could only see each other and talk to each other. That feels so far removed now.
Oh yeah.
Right. I mean, it's like you have moments where you're sprinting and then he has to go in a different direction. Right. And so it's like, man, you're like all this Jon stuff's leading, and Sam and everything that's happening north of the wall. And it's like, okay, we're getting ready for the battle of the battle at Castle Black. And no, we gotta go do the Red Wedding. Yeah. Right. And so, and I think that is one of the things why I'm totally fine. And I would be even more fine. And maybe when we've talked about splitting Winds of Winter, he should split it anyway, because there's so many big events, you run the risk of like losing momentum in certain storylines.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the issues I think the show ran into as well.
Oh,
I think they maybe looked at it and were like, hey, man, we lose momentum here and here by like shifting all over the place. I mean, we talked about it. It was on either last week or the week before on Patreon. We were looking at the upcoming chapters. Like, it's been a long time since we've had a Dany chapter. So her stuff, as I've said forever, is always feels so removed. I'd be way more fine if he split Winds of Winter. And somebody actually did post on Reddit the other day and said something similar. It's like, I'd be totally fine if he split Winds of Winter, not because of like, oh, it's just to get it out and everything, but like,
yeah,
over in Essos now you have so many characters.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean, he has a whole continent to resolve at this point. Right?
Yeah.
Like, he's got a lot to do. I mean, we've talked about the split a lot. I think that it would just be better off to have something rather than nothing. Though you have to think that with the weight that has happened now, I mean, I'm already underneath the preconceived notion that no matter what he does, there's going to be an extremely loud amount of people. And I don't know if it'll most likely be the minority of people, but there is going to be a very loud sector that no matter what he releases, the easy, and it's very memeable, so people will say it on the internet, of course, is, we waited all this time for this. So if he were to release a book that maybe felt a little bit more like a feast or a dance, where like we know we're not getting the complete story all in one volume, I think that he could run into some issues. I also wonder how much he despises the fact that he had to split a book. Like, I think he would love to just be able to kind of run away and not worry about binding issues or any of that stuff, which I understand that. I think that makes a lot of sense from an artistic standpoint. But the thing is like, if you think about things in acts, right? We think about books like 3-act structure. Not every book is written like this, but let's just say in a general sense. So a series also has an overarching like rhythm and pace to it. So if we look at the first 3 books as Act 1, which is an insane Act 1, by the way, I think we're very much waiting for like the conclusion of Act 2, which is Winds of Winter, and A Dream for Spring or any other books that would come after that, I think is kind of your third act. And your third act is generally your shortest as well, whenever you're writing a story. So we are very much waiting on the conclusion of Act 2 with Battle of the Bastards, Dany getting over here. I assume that, by the way, that might actually just be the third act. She lands, all hell breaks loose, White Walker invasion. We're off to the races and we're done. But Feast for Crows will feel a much, much better, and it already does on reread. But I agree with the comment. But I think Feast and Dance feel a lot better with that conclusion of Winds of Winter. That's why Winds of Winter is so pivotal to being released, I think, because it will enhance the books that we've already read and that we've picked up on details for. I imagine there's a lot of people that forget how much groundwork was laid in books 1 and 2, thinking about A Storm of Swords, right? Like, everything we got to that point was logically built upon to get to that point in books 1 and 2. Feast and Dance are kind of resetting. They're starting a new act, so it is a continuation of the story. But George has to reset the pacing there a little bit, and I think that him doing some more world building, a lot of character relationships, a lot of fallout from the stuff that actually happened in the first 3 books has a lot of value. I think it'll just be a lot easier to see that value once you have what I could believe to be like the conclusion to Act 2, which is Winds. So.
Yeah, I agree, and that's another reason why I'm totally fine with him splitting it, because remember, Feast was supposed to be, like Feast and Dance were supposed to be one book.
Yeah,
and then crazy. And then think about how much content he said when he's writing Dance of Dragons. Like, I'm gonna have to cut this and put this in Winds of Winter.
Well, yeah,
and it's like, okay, well, there's your second trilogy. I mean, and that would be another thing, because then, even, I know he wants it to be done in 7, but if you went to 9 books,
no one cares.
Then it's 3 trilogies, and everyone's fine. No one cares about it anyway, right? I mean, we don't live in that world.
We just want more.
Want more, bro. Yeah, it's totally fine, because, I mean, basically just essentially just finish Dance with Dragons with like, and even if you don't want it to be call it Winds of Winter, you want to call it something else. Like, I mean, he might run into an issue because everyone's expected that to be the next book.
Yeah,
but I mean, I think it's totally fine.
I think also maybe the sense that it's so obvious he could just release whatever he wants and it'll be money making. It'll get a lot of buzz. Like, at this point, he's set, right? Anything he releases is probably going to be on the bestseller list. I think it is kind of an indication that he gives a shit. right?
Yeah.
Because like he could just mail it in like very easily, but he's not. So I think he still cares quite a bit. One of the things that I always wonder about though is like just getting up there in age and stuff. Like sometimes the way you are able to express yourself in art, or in this case, writing, is changed by your life. I know many authors that have grown older and then have actually said, like, I just can't write like I used to because it puts me in such a bad place, like more so along the dark end.
Right.
Stuff. I'm thinking of a very specific author, but I talked to them in confidence, so I'm not going to say their name. But they told me, as I get older, I'm actually struggling with endings. Like endings don't mean as much to me because I'm always thinking about my ending, like my life.
Right.
And I'm like, whoa, like and I know for some people, they'll be like, yeah, whatever, write the books. We don't care. But, there is a person behind the story. And sometimes I wonder if that's part of the hang up. And maybe he set out to write something, starting in Feast for the second kind of phase of A Song of Ice and Fire. Maybe the endpoints that he was working towards don't feel right anymore. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll dialing back in a little bit on Feast for Crows. I think that I actually think it's better, right? That we have that
Yeah.
break, and you get a focus on some of these other characters, because like next I've read a little ahead, so we have in our reread we're doing Tyrion, and then we go to Davos, and it's like, wow, that feels so far removed,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
even dealing with Davos and getting that whole side of it. And it kind of reminds me again, because we were talking about Brandon Sanderson a little bit, I was thinking about like Wheel of Time and stuff like that. And my actually my chiropractor is he's into all this fantasy stuff.
Oh, really?
He's always asking me about it, and every time I go, and he's always talking about it. And he said he'd just watched Wheel of Time season 3, and so he's like thinking about reading the books. And
Heard it was phenomenal.
I did hear that season 3 is much better. And so I was asking him what's going on. I'm like, yeah, none of that stuff happened.
They're also getting an open world RPG game.
Hey,
and I'm like, how is Wheel of Time getting this?
I know.
And
Well,
we
Game of
can't get
Thrones
for
did
Game of
just get,
Thrones.
I know Game of Thrones just did a game. I need to dive back into it.
Do you though?
But yeah, maybe. But it kind of reminds me of that too, where it's like, man, I was like sprinting, like just as this comment said, I was sprinting through the Perrin arc in Wheel of Time and like Shadow Rising. I'm like, this is awesome. And then you get to Fires of Heaven, the 5th book, and it's like he's not even in it. So I think that's just something that happens in POV books where you're so
well, the scope's massive. It's
Yeah.
hard to handle. It is.
Where you get so invested in certain storylines. And I think that might be one of the reasons why people don't like Feast as much, as maybe it's just some of the storylines you were really more invested
Well,
in.
people want Tyrion, they want Dany.
Right. And some of the some of those things aren't there. And so it feels like, oh wow, like the story. And now we're suddenly getting Cersei chapters, even though they're so important. So it just always causes me to wonder, like through point of view, right? Like focusing on the story. It's not like, like Harry Potter, where you're with Harry the entire time.
Yeah.
It's his care. It's third person, but it's his point of view the entire time. And that is what it is. And that's a cool way to do it. But there's so much else going on you miss out on. So you do get more of a full world perspective of this whole thing. And then, as we talked about, doing like just point of view reads, like that's one of the things we talked about last week in that Arya chapter, even though it's really small, is if you're just reading Arya's point of view now, which is another fun way to read this series, you're like, oh man, we're getting to the gate, but things seem kind of weird. And now you actually get there. Like you walk in and suddenly like all hell is broken loose. You're like, what's going on? Like I thought I was so close. It actually makes it more heartbreaking. I think when you're doing an Arya point of view, than even if you're doing like Catelyn, who's the character who dies, because Arya is now so close. And she's at the gate and it's ripped away from her.
Snatched from the jaws of victory. I think that it kind of speaks to the tasks that George set out to do and why it's so challenging, because there's very few stories in the fantasy genre with this amount of scope. I can probably count them on 2 hands, at least the ones that have been successful in what they've set out to do. But that's the thing. I think people would be okay with a split, but here's the kicker. There was like a 4 or 5 year gap between Feast and Dance, and that's what pissed people off. If he had released Feast and then the next year released Dance, and people got their Tyrion, Dany, and Jon chapters, people would have been way less forgiving. Or way less critical, way more forgiving, because they didn't have to wait so long. People did not like that between A Storm of Swords, like they didn't get a chapter for many, many years between Storm and for Dany. So I think splitting Winds of Winter would be fine, especially if he wanted to do another geographic one. And he could do that, but one, it does mess with the structure of the plot. And then two, if he were to take, an extra 6 or even 4 years, to get out part 2, it will again, like, you could not release Winds of Winter with no Dany chapters, no, you know what I mean? Like, we need to see the cast. And also, let's be fair, the cast is now starting to shrink.
Right.
So,
well, I really liked what you said, earlier about like potentially like then it's if he did split Winds, he could actually like the faith, like you could like the faith part of the storyline could finish up in like, hey, remember he talked about a big Cersei block he was struggling with a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Then it kind of makes this second trilogy. Think about how much better Feast is going to be, which is, I think, the one that everyone criticizes as probably being the worst book in the series. Not that it's bad, but there's only 5 books. So
you got to have a least favorite. That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah. You're going to have a least favorite, but now you get to see from start to finish in like a trilogy, the Cersei storyline, which I think is one of the ones that people, that's probably their least favorite character in Feast, although even though we all love Cersei, but just kind of the internet's sentiment about it.
Yeah.
It tends to be, but now you get that, like the whole start to finish, like her as like the Mad Queen and the faith and dealing with it and dealing with all the people and the fallout of Jaime and everything.
Yeah.
And then it's like, it ends, the big cliffhanger to this is like you could end that book if you have like Dany and Jon or whatever, if you kind of split Winds of Winter geographically. Now the end can be her blowing up the Sept of Baelor.
Yeah, if that's what the way they want to go, they could absolutely, he could do that.
Right? Like, just like they did in the show or something. That's a massive, cool way to end a book and a trilogy.
If he wants to cut down on page count and these things and not sure how to fit stuff in, one thing he could have done, and he could have done this even with like the 5-year gap, is he could have released like a series of short stories or novellas as collections and been like, this is what kind of happened in the meantime. This is not uncommon. Tad Williams has done this. Drew Abercrombie's released a collection of short stories.
Comic books do that all the time, where like, here's our main arc, and then they go back and fill in the spots.
Yeah, and I almost wonder if, and the thing is like George R. R. Martin is a phenomenal short story writer, novella writer. I mean, that was his bread and butter for many years. It's like he probably could have gotten away with releasing a 2 or 3 novella collection for the in between stuff, and then maybe even been able to shrink like Feast and Dance down. Like there could have been maybe just small things that could have been replaced. But it's hindsight's 2020. But looking ahead, and as hope seems to dwindle, it's just like I wonder if there's a way for him to just get something out, just release something. But who knows? The real thing is that Feast is amazing on reread. I think it is underappreciated on the first read, but when you go back and the reread, some of those slower moments have so much to dig into. And on top of that, those are the moments that you kind of cherish on a reread, I think, are the slower, quieter moments, especially with like Jaime.
Right. Yeah, and even Brienne and Elaine, like and the Sansa stuff. I think that's something else too, is when you look at Feast in the whole thing, it's hard because we have no idea where Sansa's story is going, because it's not going at all the same place it's going in the show,
which makes it almost more interesting to read.
To me, it is. Yeah, but you still see that stuff happen in the show, so it's kind of like, okay, it's like, I think for a lot of people now, because now anyone who's reading it has likely already watched the show. Right. So totally different before, when the show didn't exist.
Yeah.
So, but now I think for people who are reading it for the first time, you're like, Feast might be your least favorite, just because you're like, all right, the Sansa stuff, like we know where this is going. But in reality, we have no idea where it's going.
Yeah,
right?
and
We have
also
no clue where it's going.
just by based off like how long things have been out and it's a little further in the series, I would imagine that Feast and Dance have the least amount of rereads comparatively to the
Yeah,
first three or the whole series. So the fun thing about it to me is that there's a lot more to discover in Feast and Dance that we don't even
yeah.
know is something, until we get
Actually,
some more game
actually,
lore.
my least favorite book to read is A Dance with Dragons.
I love Dance.
Not that the story is bad, but God, the chapters, all the chapters in it are like massive. And so you
I
really have to, like, even on audiobook, they're all like an hour. And so it's like you have to like really commit to reading to reading A Dance with Dragons.
Yeah, for me, they're short because Malazan chapters later in the series start becoming 100 to 200 pages, and you're like,
Right.
oh, it's nothing, It's
Right.
I my stamina level is very high for long, drawn out chapters. It is different though from the rest of the series in many ways, but I think it's also because he has so much to do with Danny and Marine. Like he has so much to do,
Yeah.
and it's kind of been crazy how much he gets done in Dance. Like when you think about what that book accomplishes, I think it's a really impressive book.
Yeah, Tyrion is my favorite read in A Dance with Dragons.
So good.
He's my favorite storyline when he's with young Griff and he's on the boat and you're like and he's like figuring it out. Like that's actually probably I think my favorite part of A Dance with Dragons
Yeah.
Is Tyrion figuring out who young Griff is when he's on the boat and they're playing
Mhm.
chess and he's got the dragon and I think that's probably like my favorite part
Yeah,
of
and
that
you're
whole book.
playing, the what if game. If is he
Right.
real? Is he fake? It's too
Yeah.
good.
It's
Too good.